You know those photos you see? Groups of smiling people, often in matching shirts, standing in front of something. Definitely not their hometown.
Huh?
Maybe you've even been in one. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, why these short-term mission trips, why they've become such a huge thing, especially with younger folks?
Yeah.
What's really happening there, for the people going and the communities they visit?
Those are exactly the big questions we're digging into today. The whole world of short-term missions or STMs, it's surprisingly complex, and we've got some really great research that helps us kind of peel back the layers.
Okay, let's unpack this because it feels like there's definitely more going on than just the photos suggest.
Right.
So for this deep dive, we've got some really insightful stuff. We're looking at a 2-year deep dive, someone actually embedded with a short-term mission team.
Wow, 2 years.
Yeah, from a non-denominational church. Let's call them Central Wheaton Church, CWC. The researcher followed them as they got ready for and then traveled to the Dominican Republic.
So really getting inside the experience.
Exactly. Observing meetings, presentations, having one-on-one chats, even looking closely at the actual words people used. Plus, we're bringing in the broader history, how we've talked about mission work over time. So it's this mix of deep immersion and wider context.
That sounds really valuable.
Yeah.
It's not just like one snapshot.
Mm.
This kind of in-depth work combined with other studies lets us see the bigger picture, the common stories, the narratives that really shape these trips for so many people.
Right.
Our goal here is really to understand those underlying motivations and, the stories that stick.
Totally. So if you've ever been on one of these trips or thought about it, maybe supported someone who went, or you're just curious why they're so common, this deep dive is definitely for you. We want to get past the shiny surface and explore some of the maybe unexpected stuff going on. Our mission today: understand the common stories around STMs, how they get started, how they get shared, and really importantly, what impact they actually have on everyone. We'll look at the history, why people go, and how the trips are seen, both by the visitors and the hosts.
Okay.
So to kick things off, what exactly is a short-term mission trip? Sounds simple, but maybe the definition itself is kind of interesting.
You're right. It sounds straightforward. At its core, it's a pretty short travel experience for Christian purposes.
Mhm.
Could be charity, service, evangelism.
But the range is huge, right?
Oh, absolutely massive.
Yeah.
You've got everything from like high school mime teams in Rome.
Mime teams, really?
Yeah, you have to wonder about that one. All the way to, big construction projects in Haiti after the earthquake with skilled tradespeople. It's a really wide spectrum.
And the sheer number of people,
Huh?
millions every year.
Millions, yeah. Which makes it kind of surprising, as our sources point out, that there hasn't been a ton of really deep research digging into it. Robert Priest at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, he's a key researcher who's really focused on this area.
So this huge participation, but maybe not as much academic focus as you'd expect.
Oh.
Interesting.
And it's not just an evangelical thing either. You've got Orthodox, Catholic, mainline Protestants doing similar things. Even Jewish groups and other faiths have programs that look kind of similar. Researchers like Nancy Ammerman and Robert Withnow, they've shown just how common this kind of engagement is across the board in the U.S.
Which leads right to that big question everyone asks: are these trips actually worth it?
Right.
But before we can even touch that, we need to properly understand what an STM is. How's it different from, say, someone being a missionary for years, or even just like purposeful travel?
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because even defining short-term isn't straightforward. Yeah, back in 1988, there was this one mission research group that decided anything under 2 months just wouldn't count in their missionary stats.
Wow. So these trips wouldn't even have been considered missions by that definition.
Exactly. We talk about short-term, mid-term, long-term. But honestly, there's no single agreed-upon definition for where those lines are drawn.
What I find fascinating, though, is how strongly the participants themselves push back against calling it tourism.
Oh, absolutely. Universally.
They really make a point of saying, no, this is different. This has a purpose beyond just sightseeing.
Yeah, that sense of intention, of purpose, is really key to how participants understand it. They draw a clear line between STM and just being a tourist.
Which seems to lead us straight into the power of stories, of narrative. It feels like the stories we tell about these trips are maybe the most important part of understanding them.
I think that's spot on. Narrative is it's fundamental to how we humans make sense of things, right? How we learn about the world, how we share what we learn. Arthur Asa Berger, who studies popular culture, points this out. Stories are how we learn and how we teach. And Christianity itself is so deeply rooted in narrative. I mean, think about the Bible, the parables. It's full of stories conveying truth. Susan Harding's work on Jerry Falwell, she found that understanding the community wasn't just about being there, it was about the language, the specific ways they talked about their faith.
And what's really striking with STMs is how often people go to completely different places, different countries, different situations, but they come back telling really similar stories.
Exactly. It changed my life. I got outside my comfort zone.
Yeah, you hear those phrases over and over.
So the big question the research tackles, where do these common stories come from? And how do they relate to what actually happened on the trip? Are the stories just reflecting reality? Or are they maybe shaping how people remember and interpret their experiences, kind of guiding them into a standard STM script?
And that's why the CWC study is so useful, right? Because it focused specifically on the language the team members used.
Precisely. By listening closely, the research could see how CWC's own specific way of talking about mission influenced how the travelers understood everything they saw and did. It's like the church provided this lens.
A lens. But could that lens, that powerful narrative, also maybe limit their view? Could it have downsides?
That's a really crucial point. These narratives, they provide structure, they create meaning, which is powerful for people. But yeah, they can also unintentionally obscure things.
Like what?
Well, if the main story is about, say, personal encounters, serving individuals seen as poor, and the goal is framed mostly as sharing the gospel, then the bigger picture, things like systemic poverty, historical factors, political issues, deep cultural differences, those might fade into the background. The focus stays on the interpersonal, sometimes missing the wider context.
So the narrative can create blind spots. That makes sense.
Definitely. While powerful, they aren't always the whole picture.
This makes me wonder about the history. Where did this idea of a short mission trip even come from? Because it wasn't always the norm, was it?
Not at all. If you rewind to the early 20th century, like around the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference in 1910, the main idea of a missionary was someone committed for life. It was a long-term calling.
So a lifetime commitment. What changed? How did we get to these like week-long or two-week trips?
Well, there were some earlier forms of shorter service. The LDS Church, the Mormons, they had fixed-term missionaries pretty early on. Mennonites and American Friends started programs in the 1920s, often aimed at youth, sometimes looking a bit like military service in structure. Mainline denominations joined in later. The Methodists, for instance, started a program for college grads in 1949. But the reasons and the theology behind these varied quite a bit.
And then after World War II, things picked up pace, especially with younger, more conservative Christians.
Exactly. There was this feeling among many young people that the older established mission groups weren't maybe evangelistic enough, weren't really harnessing the energy of this new generation that had seen the world during the war.
Right.
This led to new organizations popping up in the late 50s, focused specifically on youth. Groups like WAM Youth with a mission and operation mobilization, OM. Their big thing was evangelism, done by young people traveling the globe.
So a definite shift towards youth and a real emphasis on evangelism driving these trips.
Lauren Cunningham's vision for YWAM in 1956 is a classic example. This idea of waves of young people going out on missions focused purely on evangelism. That was pretty radical then.
I bet. Was there pushback from the older groups?
Oh yeah, some resistance initially. Yeah. The established agencies often preferred people with specific skills or individuals who would work directly under their long-term missionaries. But Cunningham really pushed this idea that the short trips themselves were missionary work. Not just support, not just a first step, but mission in their own right.
Interesting. And what about the Peace Corps? That started in the 60s, right? Did that have an influence? It wasn't religious, but it was about young people serving abroad.
Absolutely. The Peace Corps definitely played a role. Even early accounts acknowledged that Christian groups were already sending young volunteers overseas. And the public reaction to the Peace Corps was incredibly positive.
People loved the idea.
They did.
Yeah.
And mission leaders noticed that enthusiasm. They saw young people wanting to do this kind of short-term service, and they started using similar language, emphasizing how young people could make a real difference.
That whole youth try the impossible kind of theme.
Exactly. It tapped into that desire for challenge, for purpose, maybe pushing back against perceived complacency. Short-term missions started being framed as this concrete way for young folks to really commit their lives to their faith.
And the way the trips were promoted changed too. Less focused just on the work being done and more on how it changed the person going.
That's another key shift, yeah. You started seeing promotional materials highlighting the impact on the travelers. Testimonials from parents saying, "My kid came back completely changed." Promises of experiencing the difficulties, but also the rewards of mission work firsthand.
So this personal transformation angle became really central.
It really did. There's a great story in the source material about a student in Austria in '76. They went expecting hardship, really roughing it, but found that God used them in ways they didn't expect, even through mundane tasks. It just shows how that narrative of personal growth was really taking hold even back then.
Okay, so how did this specific church, Central Wheaton Church, get into STMs?
Well, a key figure was their youth pastor, a guy named Sam. He was reading resources like Group magazine, which was popular for youth leaders, and he got really influenced by Paul Borthwick.
Borthwick, who was he?
He was a very early, very vocal advocate for youth mission trips. He even wrote practical guidebooks on how to plan and lead them.
Ah, so the practical how-to stuff started becoming available.
Exactly. It shows how having those resources helped spread the idea and made it easier for local churches like CWC to start their own programs.
So CWC's first trip, where did they go?
Quito, Ecuador, late 1980s. Their plan was a mix, doing ministry in schools, prisons, churches, orphanages, but also making sure the students got to experience some local culture.
And how did they measure success?
A lot of it seemed to be based on the students' own testimonies afterwards. How meaningful they said it was. There were some initial questions about the cost, is this really worth the money?
Sure.
But overall, there was this strong belief that these trips were really valuable for the students' faith development, for their discipleship.
And then heading into the 90s, this just became more common, more talk about it in youth groups.
Yeah, definitely. The whole conversation, the discourse around STMs really started to solidify. People were debating what they were for, how they should be done.
Is that when ideas like vacations with a purpose came up? I think I remember hearing that phrase.
Yeah, Kim Hurst coined that VWAP. The idea was to consciously blend the cultural experience, the service aspect, and personal growth, trying to integrate it all.
But did that label stick? Vacation with a purpose?
Not really, it seems, which is interesting, right? It suggests the vacation part didn't quite fit with the dominant story that was emerging about what STM was really about.
Even if maybe the trips often included vacation-like elements.
Exactly. The narrative seemed to increasingly emphasize the mission and downplay the tourism, even if both were happening.
Okay, so that brings us right to the CWC team and their trip to the Dominican Republic, the core study we're looking at. Let's really get into their experience.
Let's do it. The way the team prepared beforehand, it really sets the scene. Their first meeting, pizza and soda.
Huh, right.
Which kind of highlights this interesting mix right from the start. You've got the idea of sacrifice that often goes with mission work, but also these very normal, enjoyable comforts.
And the fundraising letters the students sent out.
Those were really telling, too. They were told to make them personal, sure, but the church gave them a clear structure, a template almost. And that structure really guided how the trip was explained to people supporting them.
So the letters weren't just about asking for money.
No, they were also reinforcing the story, asking for prayer for the team, for the work they'd be doing. It framed the trip's purpose in a specific way.
Then there were interviews to get on the team.
Yeah, and those interviews did more than just select people. The research calls them an officializing discourse.
Officializing discourse, meaning?
Meaning the interview process itself encoded the expected narrative. The questions guided applicants to talk about following God's call, using their gifts, serving the long-term missionaries, sharing the gospel.
Ah, so it's sort of locked in the right way to think and talk about the trip.
Pretty much. It
Yeah.
seemed like there wasn't much space in that process to frame the trip differently. The language used, the questions asked, all pointed in one direction.
Even the pre-trip training.
Yeah.
Trying to prepare them for cultural differences.
That had some interesting wrinkles, too. Apparently, the students spent more time talking about negative stereotypes of Americans,
Okay.
rather than really examining their own cultural viewpoints, their own assumptions they were bringing with them, which just shows how hard it is to truly see another culture if you're not aware of your own cultural glasses,
Yeah, absolutely. And how did they picture the Dominican Republic before they went? What was their image?
It seems it was heavily filtered through the idea of poverty, often as something visual they expected to see. One student, James, actually said his trip wouldn't feel complete until he saw a man riding a donkey cart.
Wow, like a specific, almost stereotypical image?
Exactly. It was like they had this preconceived picture, and Dominican culture was often seen as something defined by, and maybe even opposed to, their own Christian identity.
So they head off carrying all these stories and expectations. What was the actual departure like?
Pretty ceremonial. They gathered at the church, took group photos, the research notes. Even Simon, who didn't want to wear the matching T-shirt at first, put it on for the photo.
The power of the group photo.
Right. And prayers focusing on unity, on what God was going to do through them. Those matching shirts are such a visible sign of that shared identity, that mission focus.
And when they arrive?
First contact was with the long-term missionaries there, the Van Sants, and they stayed in a team house run by a local organization, Ayuda para Niños, or AN. It's worth noting, too, part of their trip cost went as a donation to AN's work.
Okay. And the first impressions of the place itself?
It was mixed. They noticed things that were clearly different, like lots of scooters, the tropical plants. But they were also surprised by similarities.
Like what?
Like seeing nicer cars than they expected. It suggests the stories they'd heard had maybe set them up for a more extreme picture of poverty than what they first encountered.
And then there were those little moments like the Diet Coke thing?
Oh yeah, the quest for Diet Coke, in a can, the American kind, not the local Coke Light, and later hunting down Gatorade.
It's funny how wanting those familiar brands almost emphasized how foreign the place felt to them.
Exactly. Even though those things weren't necessarily rare, seeking them out became this way of marking the place as other, needing that familiar taste of home.
But it wasn't all just noticing differences, right? They were trying to connect, too, especially at the worksite and with kids.
Definitely. Their first big task was working on the roof of an after-school center. And they were working alongside some local Dominican boys who, sometimes, seemed to know more about the construction than they did. And those moments of working together, side by side, created feelings of connection.
And the singing.
Right, singing praise songs together in Spanish, Aleluya, Gloria a Dios. That was seen as a really powerful moment. This idea that their shared faith, their shared Christian language could bridge the cultural gap. And also the interactions with kids at the children's home, La Casa, and during the vacation Bible school. A lot of that was nonverbal hugs, smiles, playing games. These connections were often interpreted as really deep transcending language, often framed in that context of giving and serving.
But what about understanding poverty? If their initial impressions were different from expectations, how did they make sense of it?
That was complex. They clearly expected to see poverty, but they seemed unsure how to interpret what they actually saw. Emma's experience is a good example. She went from expecting the absolute worst to realizing there were different levels of need in different places.
Right.
And during the VBS, which was held in a neighborhood they perceived as poor, the kids' sheer energy and enthusiasm, sometimes that got interpreted through the lens of poverty, too.
Oh, so?
Well, seeing their excitement perhaps as a sign of emotional or spiritual poverty, something the team could meet through interaction, alongside any material needs. The focus shifted toward meeting those perceived emotional and spiritual needs.
It sounds like there was this ongoing tension, maybe, between the official mission stuff and the parts that felt more like, well, tourism.
Absolutely. That tension was definitely there. The hike they took to a waterfall, everyone loved it as a fun break.
Sure.
But then you have this moment on the bus afterwards. Phil shares some pretty heavy information about the community they just visited, and some kids are joking around, and Anne, one of the leaders, really sharply tells them off.
Wow.
It's a really stark moment that shows that clash, right? Between the narrative of serious service and sacrifice and just the normal human desire for fun and relaxation.
And did the students themselves talk about this?
Some did. Jeannie, for instance, explicitly kind of resisted that dominant "it changed my life" narrative. She talked about how her views on immigration were changing, but more because of stuff she was learning elsewhere, not just the trip. She enjoyed the fun parts, the tourism bits, but she kept them separate in her mind from the mission.
Interesting.
And another student described feeling like they had blinders on, like they were so focused on the scheduled tasks, VBS, construction, that they didn't really experience the place like a tourist might, just focused on the job.
Which kind of reflects that broader evangelical tendency sometimes, right? Prioritizing, doing, serving over just observing or learning.
It does seem to mirror that. Both STM and tourism often involve stories of personal change, but they frame it differently. Tourism might be about introspection, finding yourself, while STM emphasizes humble service, looking outward. Learning sometimes takes a back seat to the perceived main purpose of serving.
Were there exceptions? Did anyone seem to break out of those blinders?
Well, there's the example of Paul. Months after the trip, he remembered a conversation about how U.S. trade policies affected Dominican avocado farmers.
Ah, a connection to bigger systems.
Exactly. But significantly, that conversation was initiated by the researcher who was with them. It wasn't something that seemed to come up organically within the team's own discussions. These broader economic or political issues just weren't really part of the typical STM chatter.
Hmm. And what about race? You mentioned Amina was the only Black team member. How did the team handle that?
That's another area where engagement seemed limited. The research suggests the team didn't really discuss or process Amina's unique experience or the possibility that she might be receiving attention specifically because of her race in that Dominican context. It felt like a missed opportunity for deeper reflection within the group.
Okay, so reflecting on all this, the CWC experience, the history, what are some of the main criticisms people level at short-term missions? And what are the ideas for maybe doing them differently?
Yeah, the critiques are definitely out there, and they're important. Concerns about things being superficial, maybe even causing unintended harm in the host communities. There's that quote from an African church leader saying sometimes short-termers have just enough preparation to make them dangerous.
Oof, that's blunt.
It is, but it reflects a real concern from some receiving communities. There's a clear call for a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of culture, moving past simple ideas about worldview, and really engaging with how words, ideas, power, history all interact.
And maybe shifting the focus, like David Livermore suggests, prioritizing listening.
Exactly. Making the main goal understanding how the local community sees God already at work there, rather than arriving with a preset agenda of what we think needs doing.
That Kenyan pastor, Muriu, his perspective seems key too, wanting people to just genuinely be with them, not just show up with projects.
Yes, his point about wanting real relationship, real faithfulness to the gospel message, not just superficial interactions, is really powerful. He's aware when engagement isn't deep.
And that story about the Costa Rican students wanting to come serve the poor in Wheaton, that really flips the script, doesn't it?
It really does. It holds up a mirror to the assumptions often baked into North American STM trips, and highlights how crucial it is to listen to local perspectives on what need even looks like.
So the way forward might involve a broader view of mission, like the Missio Dei idea.
That seems to be where a lot of the thinking is heading. Understanding God's mission, the Missio Dei, as much bigger, encompassing all of human life, integrating the spiritual, personal, material, social needs, not just narrowly focusing on saving souls, or conversely, only on secular development.
And that would require changes in how trips are planned and talked about?
For sure, both structural changes, maybe reorienting trips around education, mutual learning, community goals, and narrative changes. Crucially, giving local leaders genuine control over what happens when teams visit.
And what happens after the trip seems really important too, the follow-up.
Hugely important and often overlooked or underdeveloped. The research really emphasizes planning mandatory follow-up sessions, a space to really process what was learned, what the impact was, maybe challenge some of those initial, simpler narratives that form.
Because otherwise the story just snaps back to the pre-trip expectations.
Often, yeah. Without guided reflection, people tend to fit the experience into the story they already had. Those first few months back home are actually critical for developing a more complex, lasting understanding.
Okay, so bringing this all together. The big takeaway seems to be that these trips, STMs, they're really complex, and they're profoundly shaped by the stories we tell about them.
Right. Those stories, those narratives, they build community, they inspire people, which is real. But they can also maybe unintentionally limit our view of the places we go and the deeper issues involved.
And the whole idea of mission, the history, the motivations, even the definition, it's all evolved so much over time.
Definitely. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? About the stories surrounding any kind of service or cross-cultural work you might be involved in. What are the assumptions buried in those narratives? Whose perspective is front and center? Whose might be missing?
Yeah. How can we get beyond stories that might be limiting and foster something deeper, more meaningful?
Good questions. This deep dive, it's really just scratching the surface. There's so much more to explore in the sources we mentioned, and it's worth reflecting on your own experiences or views. What does it really mean to connect and serve across cultures effectively and respectfully?
It's a huge question.
It is. And maybe one final thought to chew on. If the main goal of short-term missions really shifted away from what the visitors primarily do towards how intentionally they listen and learn, what would that actually change? How might that affect the experience and the long-term impact for everyone involved, visitors and hosts alike?